The dust cloud on the horizon grew larger with each passing minute, and 8-year-old Emma clutched her twin brother Samuel's trembling hand as they crouched behind the overturned wagon. The Apache war party had struck their family's homestead at dawn, leaving nothing but smoke and silence in their wake. Their parents lay motionless near the burning cabin, and the twins had watched helplessly as their older sister Martha was dragged away on horseback. The autumn wind carried the acrid smell of destruction across the Colorado territory, mixing with the metallic scent of fear that clung to their small bodies. Samuel's blue eyes were wide with terror as he pressed closer to his sister, both children too frightened to even whisper. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made Emma's heart pound against her ribs, like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Through a gap in the wagon's broken wheel, she could see a lone rider approaching from the east, his massive silhouette cutting an imposing figure against the pale morning sky. The man sat atop a coal-black stallion that snorted and pawed the ground with obvious impatience, its breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. As the rider drew closer, Emma could make out his enormous frame, easily 6.5 feet tall even while seated, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. His weathered face bore the marks of countless battles, and a thick beard covered most of his jaw, giving him the appearance of a mountain bear wrapped in leather and steel. Samuel tugged at Emma's torn calico dress, pointing with a shaking finger at the stranger's gun belt. 2 massive Colt revolvers hung low on his hips, their worn handles speaking of frequent use, and a Winchester rifle rested easily across his saddle horn. The man's dark eyes swept across the devastation with the practiced gaze of someone who had seen too much death and destruction in his lifetime. His clothes were the color of desert sand and prairie grass, blending him naturally with the harsh landscape that stretched endlessly in all directions. When he dismounted, his boots hit the ground with the solid thump of someone accustomed to making his presence known, and the children instinctively shrank deeper into their hiding place. "I know you're there, young ones," the giant's voice rumbled like distant thunder, surprisingly gentle despite its power. "Name's Clayton Murdoch, and I ain't gonna hurt you." He moved with careful deliberation, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons as he approached the overturned wagon. Emma felt Samuel's grip tighten on her hand, and she could see the conflict in her brother's tear-streaked face, the desperate need for help warring against the terror of trusting a stranger. The man called Clayton stopped several feet away and slowly lowered himself to one knee, bringing his intimidating height down to a less threatening level. His dark eyes were kind, despite the hard lines etched around them by years of sun and wind. "Your folks?" Clayton asked softly, though his gaze had already taken in the tragic scene near the cabin. Emma's voice caught in her throat, but Samuel managed to whisper, "Dead." The word hung in the air like a gunshot, final and devastating in its simplicity. Clayton's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Emma caught a glimpse of something dangerous flickering in his eyes before it was carefully controlled. He glanced toward the horizon where the dust cloud had long since disappeared, then back at the children, with an expression that mixed sorrow with grim determination. "Your sister too?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. Emma found her voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "They took Martha." The tears she had been holding back finally spilled over, cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Samuel's small body began to shake with silent sobs, and Emma pulled him closer, trying to be strong for both of them despite her own terror. Clayton studied their faces for a long moment, and Emma could almost see him weighing options in his mind, like a shopkeeper counting coins. The wind picked up, sending tumbleweeds rolling past the destroyed homestead, and carrying with it the promise of winter's approach. In just a few weeks, the first snows would begin to fall, and survival would become even more challenging for anyone caught unprepared. "How old are you children?" Clayton asked, his voice maintaining that careful gentleness that seemed at odds with his fearsome appearance. 8, Emma replied, speaking for both of them, as she had always done. Samuel had been born second, and somehow that minute's difference had made her feel responsible for him from the very beginning. Clayton nodded slowly, his experienced eyes taking in their torn clothing, the scratches on their arms, and the hollow look of children who had witnessed horrors no young person should ever see. He glanced again at the cabin, now nothing more than charred timber and broken dreams, then at the small crosses their father had carved for the family cemetery. The weight of responsibility seemed to settle on his broad shoulders like a familiar burden. "Listen to me carefully," Clayton said, his tone becoming more serious but no less gentle. Winter's coming fast, and this territory ain't safe for young ones alone. Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air, and Samuel pressed even closer against her side. The cowboy continued, "I know of a place in a town called Silver Creek, about 3 days' ride south. Good folks there, including a woman named Mrs. Henderson who runs the schoolhouse and takes in orphaned children." The word orphaned hit Emma like a physical blow, making the reality of their situation finally sink in completely. They were alone in the world now, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the fading memories of their parents' love. Clayton must have seen the fear in their faces because he quickly continued, "I'm heading that direction anyway. Got business in Silver Creek." Emma studied his face, looking for any sign of deception, but finding only honest concern. Samuel whispered something in her ear, so quietly that Clayton couldn't hear, but Emma shook her head firmly. "Please, don't leave us here," she said aloud, her voice growing stronger with desperation. The giant cowboy's expression softened even further, and Emma saw something she hadn't expected. A man who understood what it meant to be alone and vulnerable in an unforgiving world. He stood slowly, his decision apparently made, and walked toward his horse with purposeful strides. When Clayton returned, he carried a heavy woolen blanket and a leather pouch that clinked softly with coins. "This was your pa's land, which means it's rightfully yours now," he said, handing Emma the pouch. "I'll see that the territorial office knows about the claim, and when you're older you can decide what to do with it." Emma stared at the pouch in amazement. She had never held so much money in her young life, and the weight of it felt like both hope and responsibility. Samuel reached out tentatively to touch the soft blanket, his first smile in hours flickering across his dirt-stained face. Clayton wrapped the blanket around both children, and for the first time since the attack, Emma felt the beginning of warmth and safety. But as she looked toward the horizon where her sister had disappeared, she couldn't shake the feeling that their real journey was just beginning. Clayton lifted Emma onto his horse first, settling her securely in front of the saddle horn before reaching for Samuel. The black stallion, whose name was Thunder according to Clayton, stood perfectly still despite carrying an unfamiliar burden, as if the great animal understood the gravity of the situation. Samuel clung tightly to Emma's waist as Clayton swung up behind them both, his massive frame providing a wall of protection against the harsh prairie wind. "We'll make camp by Willow Creek tonight," Clayton explained, his deep voice vibrating through his chest and somehow making Emma feel safer than she had since the attack. The horse moved forward at an easy walk, carrying its precious cargo away from the destroyed homestead and toward an uncertain future. As they rode, Clayton began to talk in that same gentle tone, clearly trying to distract the children from their grief. He told them about Thunder, how he'd found the stallion as a wild Mustang and spent months earning the animal's trust rather than breaking its spirit. "A horse that chooses to be your partner is worth 10 that are forced into service," he explained, and Emma felt the truth of those words resonate in her young heart. Samuel, who had barely spoken since the attack, surprised them both by asking, "Did Thunder have a family too?" Clayton was quiet for a long moment before answering, "He did, little man. Sometimes life takes away what we love most, but that don't mean we stop looking for new reasons to keep going." The wisdom in his words was clearly beyond Samuel's years, but Emma understood perfectly. By midday, the sun had burned away the morning chill, and Clayton stopped beside a clear stream to let Thunder drink and give the children a chance to stretch their legs. Emma watched as the giant cowboy moved with surprising grace, gathering wood for a small fire and producing food from his saddlebags with the efficiency of someone accustomed to caring for himself on the trail. He heated beans and hardtack over the flames, and though the meal was simple, it was the first food the twins had eaten since yesterday's breakfast. Samuel ate hungrily, while Emma picked at her portion, her mind still spinning with questions about what would happen to them. Clayton seemed to sense her anxiety because he began sharing stories of Silver Creek and the kind people who lived there. "Mrs. Henderson lost her own husband and children to cholera 5 years back," Clayton explained, poking at the fire with a stick. Instead of letting grief consume her, she decided to help other children who found themselves alone in the world. Emma looked up at him with new interest, recognizing something familiar in the woman's story. "She sounds like someone who understands," Emma said quietly, and Clayton nodded approvingly. "Understanding is the first step toward healing, little miss." Samuel had finished eating and was now attempting to pet Thunder's nose, giggling when the horse's whiskers tickled his small palm. It was the first genuine laughter Emma had heard from her brother since the tragedy, and she felt a tiny spark of hope kindle in her chest. That evening, as they made camp beneath a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch, Emma finally asked the question that had been burning inside her all day. "Are you going to look for Martha?" Clayton was quiet for so long that Emma thought he might not answer. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard experience. "The Apache who took her. They're led by a warrior named Red Wolf, and they're heading deep into territory where most white men fear to tread." Emma's heart sank, but Clayton wasn't finished. "But that don't mean she's lost forever, little one. Sometimes the impossible just takes a little longer." There was something in his tone that made Emma believe he wasn't just offering empty comfort, and for the first time since the attack, she dared to hope that her sister might still be alive. Samuel had fallen asleep wrapped in Clayton's blanket. His small body finally relaxed for the first time in 2 days. Clayton sat with his back against a boulder, his rifle across his knees, keeping watch over his temporary charges with the vigilance of a guardian angel. Emma tried to sleep but found herself studying the cowboy's weathered profile in the firelight, wondering what had shaped this gentle giant into the man he had become. "You don't have to take care of us," she said softly, not wanting to wake Samuel but needing to voice the guilt that was eating at her. Clayton turned to look at her, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames, and Emma saw depths of pain there that matched her own recent loss. "Maybe I need taking care of too, in a different way," he replied quietly. The next morning brought the distant sound of gunfire echoing across the prairie, causing Clayton to immediately tense and reach for his weapons. Emma watched as his entire demeanor changed in seconds, transforming from gentle protector to dangerous predator as he scanned the horizon with practiced eyes. "Trouble coming from the north," he muttered, more to himself than to the children. Samuel stirred sleepily in Emma's arms, unaware of the potential danger, but Emma felt her heart begin racing again with familiar terror. Clayton made a quick decision, lifting both children and carrying them to a natural depression behind some rocks where they would be hidden from view. "Stay here and don't make a sound no matter what happens," he commanded, his voice now carrying the authority of a man accustomed to life and death situations. Emma watched through a gap in the rocks as 3 riders approached their camp, their clothes and bearing marking them clearly as outlaws. The leader was a thin man with cruel eyes and a scar running from his left temple to his jaw, and Emma instinctively pulled Samuel closer as she recognized the type of men her father had always warned them about. Clayton stood calmly beside the dying embers of their fire, his hands resting casually near his guns, but Emma could see the coiled tension in his massive frame. "Morning, stranger," the scarred man called out with false friendliness. "Saw your smoke and thought we might share some coffee and conversation." Clayton's response was measured and careful, but Emma could hear the steel beneath his polite words. "Coffee's gone cold and I was just breaking camp." The outlaws dismounted despite Clayton's obvious reluctance to welcome them, spreading out in a way that would make it difficult for him to watch all 3 simultaneously. Emma pressed her hand over Samuel's mouth as her brother started to whisper a question, keeping him silent as Clayton had commanded. The scarred leader walked closer to Clayton, clearly testing the big man's resolve, while his companions began looking through the saddlebags with obvious intent to steal whatever they could find. "Traveling alone, are you?" the leader asked, his voice carrying a note of suspicion. Emma held her breath, knowing that their lives might depend on Clayton's answer, and watched as the giant cowboy's hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to his gun. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Emma realized she was about to witness something that would change all of their lives forever. "Mostly alone," Clayton replied evenly, his eyes never leaving the scarred leader, while somehow keeping track of the other 2 men ransacking his supplies. Emma could see the calculation in his gaze as he assessed threats and angles, like a chess master planning several moves ahead. The outlaw leader grinned unpleasantly, revealing teeth stained brown by tobacco and neglect, clearly interpreting Clayton's words as a sign of weakness rather than the careful truth they actually represented. "Well then, friend, seems to me a man traveling alone don't need all these fine supplies," the bandit said, gesturing toward Clayton's well-maintained gear. One of the other outlaws had found Clayton's spare ammunition and was stuffing it into his own saddlebags with obvious greed. Samuel trembled against Emma's side, but she kept her hand firmly over his mouth, knowing that discovery would mean death for all of them. The tension reached its breaking point when the 3rd outlaw discovered the children's small bundle of belongings that Clayton had salvaged from their destroyed home. "Hey, boss," the man called out, holding up one of Emma's torn dresses. "This here's a little girl's dress. You said he was traveling alone." The scarred leader's expression darkened as he turned back to Clayton with renewed suspicion and malice. Emma felt her blood turn to ice as she realized their presence had been discovered, and she watched Clayton's shoulders set in a way that spoke of violent resolution. "Where are they?" the leader demanded, his hand moving to rest on his gun handle. Clayton remained perfectly still for another heartbeat, then spoke with deadly calm. "You boys picked the wrong man to rob today." What happened next occurred with such speed that Emma could barely follow the action. Clayton's hands moved like striking snakes, both Colts clearing leather simultaneously as he dove sideways behind Thunder for cover. The outlaws were fast, but Clayton was faster and infinitely more experienced, his first shots taking down the two men by the supplies before they could even draw their weapons. The leader managed to get his gun out, but fired wild as Clayton's bullet punched through his shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees in the dust. The entire gunfight lasted less than 10 seconds, but the echoes of gunshots seemed to reverberate across the prairie for an eternity. Samuel had buried his face against Emma's shoulder, sobbing quietly from terror, while Emma stared in amazement at the deadly efficiency Clayton had just displayed. Clayton emerged from behind Thunder with his gun still drawn, approaching the wounded outlaw leader with the careful steps of a predator, ensuring its prey was truly defeated. "You're the Scarface Murphy gang," Clayton said, and Emma heard recognition in his voice. "Been hunting you boys for the better part of 2 months." Emma's eyes widened as she realized Clayton wasn't just a drifting cowboy, he was a lawman of some kind, though she couldn't see a badge anywhere on his person. Murphy clutched his bleeding shoulder and glared up at Clayton with hatred and pain warring in his cruel eyes. "You're that bounty hunter, Clay Murdoch," Murphy gasped through gritted teeth. "Thought you was dead." Clayton's smile was cold as winter wind. "Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated, Murphy." Emma watched in fascination as Clayton efficiently tied up the wounded outlaw and checked the other two men to ensure they posed no further threat. His movements were professional and practiced, speaking of years spent in this deadly profession. Yet when he glanced toward their hiding place, his expression immediately softened with concern for the children. "It's safe now, little ones," he called gently, and Emma slowly emerged from behind the rocks with Samuel clinging to her hand. The contrast between the lethal gunfighter she had just witnessed and the gentle protector who had cared for them was jarring, but somehow she felt safer rather than more afraid. This man had skills that could keep them alive in a dangerous world, and he had chosen to use those skills to protect rather than harm them. "Who are you really?" Emma asked as Clayton helped Samuel mount Thunder again, her young voice carrying more curiosity than fear. Clayton paused in adjusting the stirrups and looked at her with those thoughtful dark eyes. "I'm exactly who I said I was, little miss. Clayton Murdoch, but I used to be a U.S. Marshal before I took to bounty hunting." Emma processed this information, understanding now why he moved with such authority and why the outlaws had recognized him. Samuel had stopped crying and was listening intently, his 8-year-old mind clearly fascinated by the revelation that their rescuer was a famous lawman. "Why did you stop being a marshal?" Samuel asked, with the directness that only children possessed. Clayton was quiet for a long moment, loading Murphy onto one of the dead outlaw's horses for transport to the nearest jail. "Sometimes the law ain't fast enough to save the people you care about," Clayton finally answered, his voice carrying old pain. Emma understood that there was a story behind those words, probably involving loss similar to what she and Samuel had experienced. Clayton secured Murphy's bonds and gathered the reins of the extra horses, clearly planning to deliver the outlaw to justice while continuing to escort the children to safety. The fact that he could have simply left them hidden while he dealt with his bounty hunting business, but instead chose to protect them through the danger, spoke volumes about his character. Emma felt a warmth growing in her chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. It was the beginning of trust in someone who had already proven himself worthy of it. As they resumed their journey toward Silver Creek, now with the addition of prisoners and extra horses, Emma found herself studying Clayton with new eyes. The gentle giant who told stories and shared his blanket was also a deadly gunfighter who could face down 3 armed men without flinching. But rather than finding this contradiction frightening, Emma discovered it made her feel more secure than ever. In this harsh territory where danger could appear without warning, they needed someone who could protect them, with both kindness and violence when necessary. Samuel seemed to share her feelings, asking Clayton endless questions about his adventures as a marshal and bounty hunter, his young voice bright with admiration and excitement. The morning's events had revealed another side of their protector, but they had also shown Emma something about herself. When the shooting started, she hadn't panicked or frozen with terror. Instead, she had kept Samuel quiet and hidden, thinking clearly despite her fear. Maybe she was stronger than she had realized, and maybe survival in this unforgiving land was possible with the right guide. Clayton caught her looking at him and smiled, that same gentle expression that seemed so at odds with the guns at his hips. "You did good back there, Emma," he said quietly. "Kept your brother safe and stayed calm under pressure. How your folks would be proud." The praise warmed her more than any blanket could, and Emma felt something she hadn't experienced since the attack: hope for the future, and confidence that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to work out after all. Silver Creek appeared on the horizon like a mirage of hope, its wooden buildings and church spire rising from the prairie grass, as welcome as water to a man dying of thirst. Emma felt her stomach clench with nervous anticipation as they approached the town, knowing that in a few short hours, her life with Clayton would end, and a new chapter would begin with strangers. Samuel seemed to sense her anxiety and reached back to squeeze her hand, his own small face serious with the weight of impending change. Clayton had grown quieter as they neared their destination, and Emma wondered if he was having second thoughts about leaving them here. The prisoner, Murphy, had been largely silent since his capture, but now he began making crude comments about what happened to pretty little girls in frontier towns, earning himself a sharp look from Clayton that promised swift retribution for any further remarks. Mrs. Henderson met them at the schoolhouse door, her kind face lined with years of caring for other people's children, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun that couldn't quite contain its natural curl. She was exactly as Clayton had described, warm, motherly, and possessing the sort of quiet strength that came from surviving tremendous loss and choosing to help others rather than becoming bitter. Emma found herself studying the woman's face for any signs of false kindness or hidden cruelty, but saw only genuine compassion and understanding. Samuel pressed closer to Emma's side as introductions were made, his earlier bravery deserting him in the face of another major change. Clayton lifted them both down from Thunder's back, and Emma noticed how he seemed reluctant to let them go, his large hands lingering on their shoulders protectively. "I've prepared a room for them," Mrs. Henderson said softly, her voice carrying the musical cadence of education and refinement. "And there are other children here who understand what they've been through." Emma felt a flicker of hope at the mention of others like them, orphans who had lost everything but somehow found the strength to continue living. Clayton knelt down to their level, his weathered face serious as he prepared to say goodbye. But before he could speak, Samuel surprised everyone by throwing his small arms around the big man's neck. "Don't leave us," Samuel whispered, echoing Emma's earlier plea, but with even more desperation. Emma felt tears threaten as she watched Clayton's face struggle with emotion, clearly torn between duty and the unexpected attachment he had formed to these children who had lost so much. Clayton gently disentangled himself from Samuel's embrace and looked directly into Emma's eyes, with an intensity that made her feel as if he could see straight through to her soul. "I made you a promise about getting you somewhere safe, and Mrs. Henderson will take better care of you than a rough old bounty hunter ever could," he said. But Emma could hear the uncertainty in his voice. She summoned all her courage and spoke the words that had been building in her heart since the gunfight that morning. "What about Martha? You said the impossible just takes a little longer." Clayton's eyes widened slightly at having his own words thrown back at him, and Emma pressed her advantage. "You're the only one who might be able to find her. Please don't give up on our sister, Mrs." Henderson watched this exchange with growing understanding, her experienced eyes taking in the depth of connection that had formed between the unlikely trio. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring while Clayton wrestled with the decision that would change all their lives. Emma could see the war being fought behind his dark eyes, duty versus attachment, safety versus danger, the practical choice versus the one his heart was demanding he make. Finally, he stood up slowly and turned to Mrs. Henderson with an expression of grim determination. "Ma'am, I wonder if you might be willing to care for these children for a few weeks while I take care of some unfinished business." Emma's heart leaped with sudden hope as she realized what he was considering. Mrs. Henderson smiled knowingly and nodded her agreement, clearly understanding the unspoken meaning behind Clayton's carefully chosen words. Samuel clapped his hands together with delight, and even Murphy, still tied to his horse, snorted with what might have been amusement at the bounty hunter's obvious attachment to the orphaned twins. Clayton spent the next hour making arrangements with the local sheriff for Murphy's incarceration and gathering supplies for what would undoubtedly be a dangerous journey into Apache territory. Emma watched him work with growing anticipation, finally daring to believe that Martha might actually have a chance of rescue. When Clayton emerged from the general store with new ammunition and extra provisions, his face had taken on the hard look of a man preparing for war. "I can't promise anything," he told Emma and Samuel seriously. "Red Wolf's band is dangerous, and your sister might not—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but Emma understood the possibilities and accepted them. "She's stronger than she looks," Emma said firmly. "Martha taught me how to shoot Pa's old rifle, and she knows how to survive." Clayton nodded, filing away this information about the girl he was preparing to risk his life to save. The goodbye this time was different from the one they had almost shared an hour earlier, filled with hope rather than finality, promise rather than abandonment. Clayton mounted Thunder and adjusted his hat against the afternoon sun, every inch the legendary gunfighter preparing to ride into legend once more. "I'll be back," he promised, and Emma believed him completely. Samuel waved enthusiastically as horse and rider headed north toward the distant mountains where the Apache made their strongholds, while Emma stood silently beside Mrs. Henderson, her hand shading her eyes as she watched Clayton disappear into the shimmering heat waves. "He's a good man, Mrs. Henderson observed quietly, and Emma nodded, knowing that they had been blessed to encounter one of the few people in this harsh territory who would risk everything for strangers simply because it was the right thing to do. 3 weeks later, Emma was helping Mrs. Henderson with the evening meal when Samuel came running from his lookout post by the schoolhouse window, shouting that riders were approaching from the north. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs as she wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, squinting into the setting sun to make out the approaching figures. There were 2 riders, one large and familiar, the other smaller, and riding awkwardly as if unaccustomed to being in the saddle. As they drew closer, Emma could see that the smaller figure had long, dark hair and was wearing what looked like Apache clothing, but the face— Emma began running before her mind had fully processed what her eyes were telling her. Samuel close behind, both of them shouting Martha's name with voices cracked by emotion and disbelief. The reunion was everything Emma had dreamed of during the long nights of waiting, tearful and joyous, and perfect in its completeness. Martha was thinner and bore the marks of her ordeal, but her eyes were bright with life and fierce with the strength that had helped her survive captivity among the Apache. Clayton sat quietly on Thunder, watching the family reunion with satisfaction written clearly across his weathered features, and Emma realized that this moment was worth every risk he had taken. Later, after Martha had been fed and bathed and tucked into bed with her siblings, Emma found Clayton on the schoolhouse porch, staring up at the stars that seemed so much brighter now that her family was whole again. "Thank you," she said simply, the 2 words carrying the weight of everything she couldn't express. Clayton smiled and ruffled her hair with one massive hand, and Emma understood that some bonds forged in hardship and sealed with courage would last a lifetime, connecting a legendary gunfighter to 2 orphaned children who had taught him that sometimes the most important battles aren't won with guns, but with the simple decision to never give up on the people you love.